So it's the 5th of February, is that right? Yeah, 5th of February, Saturday night, 5th of February, 2022. And the current theme is metta. My preferred translation for that is Goodwill. I also like another translation by another Ajahn, non-judgmental awareness. That's also metta. Friendliness. So there's these teachings on how to harmonize with each other in the Sangha, with one's friends in the holy life. 3 of that list is bodily acts of goodwill, verbal acts of goodwill, mental acts, i.e. thoughts of goodwill, toward one another, toward one's companions in the holy life. Also holding in common that view which is noble and liberating. That's how to remain harmonious in the holy life. So the Buddha's raising up goodwill. And curiously enough, I was trying to find if there was a disciple who was foremost in metta, and that doesn't seem to be a category in terms of the great disciples. So a little bit curious, but I think because if there was someone who was foremost in metta, there'd have to be someone who was foremost in karuna, mudita, upekkha. So those aren't included in categories of the great disciples. However, I did see what Ratapala, Venerable Ratapala, was foremost in, which to clear the record, I said in a previous teaching, I thought he was foremost in Asubha. Actually, he's foremost in those who went forth out of faith. And there's no foremost in Asubha either. The closest you get to that is Venerable Nanda, who was foremost in sense restraint. So metta is been enjoying looking up teachings around metta. So thinking about acts of body, speech, and mind, of goodwill, how to cultivate that, how to practice with that. In December of 2019, when I went to Thailand with Luang Por, he invited me to go with him that year, and even though I've been an abbot since December of 2017, or at least since the beginning of 2018, but I was co-abbots with Ajahn Krutadamo, and then, of course, in mid-20, in 2020, then he stepped down as co-abbot, or you could say retired, and then I was, then it's just me called abbot. So we knew that was coming. So in December 2019, went to pay respects to Luang Por Liam, and Luang Por Pasano wanted to introduce me as like the abbot of Abhayagiri, and then usually when Luang Por Liam talks about abbots, then he kind of, really downplays it, has a lot of equanimity about it, and when abbots come to him and say like, oh, do you have advice for abbots? And he'll say things like, the abbot's duty is to show people where the toilets are, that's all. Or yeah, people call me the abbot, but that's their business, or things like that. But in this case, it was a little bit different. He said, oh, abbot of Abhayagiri, that's going to be heavy. But then he said, but the way you get strong is by lifting heavy things. So the analogy that came to my mind today actually was being an abbot is like juggling bowling balls. So when you hear that, like that I'm juggling bowling balls, if any of you had the thought, oh, I'd like to carry one of those bowling balls for him, help him out a bit, then that's metta. That's good. That's a thought of goodwill. So that gives a sense of how to start to cultivate it. Bodily acts of goodwill, that would be things like helping out, helpfulness, like Skip offering me a coffee just before tea time, which I found very helpful this evening because I was feeling a bit worn out, a bit tired. So that's an act of metta, that's an act of goodwill. So, or just wanting to help out in various ways, that helping out, that seeing that somebody needs help and just helping out, lending a hand, that's a bodily act of goodwill. So that's metta in practice, that's metta kammatthana. Verbal acts of goodwill, checking in, say, how are you doing? That's a verbal act of goodwill. Or if you sense maybe somebody's not doing so well, how's it going? Do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about it? That's also metta kammatthana. So it's very simple. It's not some abstract state of universal love or just walking around with a huge grin on our face with our eyes wide all the time. That's not really metta. That's cause for concern when that happens. And it does happen sometimes. But metta is more that's very simple, very basic goodwill for one another, helpfulness. So I just love these Ajahn Sona readings. And this book, Bloom, is really wonderful because it's coming back to that very basic, that very simple practice of just being present and being present with one another and being kind. And sometimes we have to really just suffer a lot and we end up coming full circle, or sometimes we have to tie ourselves up in knots before we realize that it's about basic simplicity. Metta is, even though there's not a disciple of the Buddha's who is classed as foremost in metta, nevertheless, the Buddha praises it in many places. And it was very easy to find suttas about metta, about goodwill. One sutta, he talks about metta as like if someone has genuine goodwill for a finger snap, one is worthy of alms food, worthy of robes, worthy of a lodging, worthy of medicinal requisites that are freely offered by the lay people. One is worthy of offerings, worthy of hospitality, worthy of respect. Needless to say, how much more so if one actually cultivates it and makes much of it. And it's a type of boon, it's a type of merit which builds on itself. There's in the beginning of the metta section of the Bloom book, of Ajahn Sona's book, there's a one-line quote from Ajahn Sona, goodwill, metta, is its own reward. So it truly is. It's a type of merit that builds on itself. It is meritorious. It is fundamental goodness just to have it, and then it leads to more and more of that goodness and well-being. So it builds on itself. So it's really worth cultivating that sense of goodwill. It can also lead to a sense of strength, and it can also lead to a sense of confidence. Another interesting sutta that I came across on metta, the Buddha says that for one who cultivates metta for just a finger snap is said to have jhana, which is one of these strange, unusual teachings. Well, that doesn't seem to match teachings on jhana in the other suttas. Needless to say, much more so of one who cultivates it and makes much of it. One who cultivates metta for the duration of a finger snap is said to be not devoid of jhana. So it's an interesting teaching. There's another one where the Buddha says one who has metta for the duration of a finger snap is said to be in the presence of Brahma. Needless to say, much more so for one who cultivates it and makes much of it. So one starts to get a feeling for the Buddha's emphasis on the cultivation of goodwill, of metta. And then we can even take it a step further, where we bring it into the contemplation of impermanence, the reflection on impermanence. So that's the view which is noble and liberating, which unites us. So that's also, I like to think of anicca nusati, the contemplation of impermanence. That's also what Luang Por would say, maine, not sure. So the view of not sure is the view that is noble and liberating. Whenever we're able to say not sure to our deeply held worldly beliefs and convictions, that's liberating. That's noble and liberating. We don't have to get upset. We don't have to be angry. We don't have to be irritated if somebody disagrees with a worldly view of ours. So that's the Dhamma viewpoint, is maine, is not sure. So we're able to say not sure to these things. And samsara is complicated and variegated and has so many, it's a kaleidoscope of views and opinions and experiences, and it's all not sure. So it's very easy to get along, despite our whatever political beliefs we held before we ordained or whatever. It's very easy to get along when we're able to say not sure to all these things. There's also the teachings on the possible and the impossible. This is in the Book of the Ones. For one who has the Dhamma eye, for one who's fathomed the Dhamma, penetrated the Dhamma, it's impossible that they would see any condition as permanent, as certain. But for one who hasn't attained the eye of the Dhamma, it is possible that they will see a condition as sure, as certain, as permanent, as fixed. That is possible. So coming back to metta, though, this is really gives us ground to stand on, and it's quite the cultivation of metta. We can easily think of times somebody might have helped us out or said something kind to us, so this is very easy. And when we talk about having metta for ourselves, this is very simple and very basic, or the word Ajahn Sona is using, primary. It's a very primary thing that we can be doing for ourselves, just having goodwill for ourselves. Doing something for ourselves which is helpful, such as doing sitting meditation or walking meditation. That's a bodily act of goodwill to ourselves. Actually getting into the sitting posture, actually going to the walking meditation path, that's a bodily action of goodwill to ourselves. Verbal actions of goodwill to ourselves, that's like learning chanting. A lot of us are learning chanting, using the winter retreat to learn some chanting, learning the Patimokkha, learning some of the Paritta chants, memorizing the morning and evening chanting if we haven't done that yet. Those are verbal acts of goodwill to ourselves. Or thoughts of goodwill to ourselves. being kind to ourselves, not being harsh and critical with ourselves. Sometimes we might need to give ourselves what we would call tough love, tough metta, which is putting pressure on ourselves to go do sitting meditation, go do walking meditation. We might have to do that sometimes to put a bit of pressure on ourselves, but that doesn't preclude that sense of goodwill. Or we might have to give somebody some sort of encouragement or point something out which is difficult to hear. But that can also be goodwill because ultimately it's going to help them. This is what sometimes we might have a hard time with Lumpur Cha or if a senior teacher wants to point something out to us or give some sort of what we call encouragement. I don't like the word admonishment. Admonishment is like a punishment, but out of goodwill, wanting to see someone develop to a higher level, then that can be painful. That can be a difficult, painful growth process sometimes, but it doesn't preclude that sense of goodwill that it's coming from. We have to make sure, though, that we have an intention of goodwill. This happens all too often when students of a teacher might try to copy their teacher. They copy the external form of the teacher. This would happen with somebody like Ajahn Mahabua, where sometimes a student might try to copy the external form by being very fierce or very tough, but the internal might not be the same as Ajahn Mahabua, where from Ajahn Mahabua is coming from goodwill, coming from metta, coming from compassion, karuna. And that would be very clear for people who lived with him for a long time, or knew him for a long time. By the way, in the suttas it says one cannot know someone, one cannot know another person unless one lives with them for a long time, not for a short time, and then for one who is discerning, not for one who is undiscerning. So it's actually hard to know the internal qualities of another person unless we're around them for a very, very long time and seen them in many different situations. When one sees someone in a difficult situation, their fortitude is revealed. When one sees someone in a compromising situation, their sila, their virtue is revealed. So it's very hard to know other people. But sometimes you get these unfortunate scenarios where the goodwill may or may not have been there, but it wouldn't have the same good effect that it would have when Ajahn Mahabua would, say, be rough with somebody. So when we speak or act, having that, the mind is the forerunner, so having that intention of goodwill is very important. So goodwill for ourselves, goodwill for others. And there's so many qualities the Buddha talks about. We have these ideals. We talk about the Karaniya Mata Sutta, where this is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful. So we might think I need to be peaceful and calm and wise and skillful all the time, or else I'm not doing so good. So that's an ideal. But I think it's easier to get close to those ideals if we have goodwill for ourselves. That gives us some ground to stand on, gives us energy. I remember one time walking up the hill a few years ago, and I was really upset about something, and it was really draining my energy. And I passed Ajahn Sek on the trail, and he said, in English, he said, "Are you tired?" Yes, when we don't have metta, we're tired. When we have metta, we have a lot of energy. Could feel the metta coming from him in that case. Being humble, I mean, this is part of it as well. I might meander and look at some of these different qualities. I might think, sometimes it's hard to be humble as a monk who becomes more senior. This is a reflection that just has been coming up for me a lot in recent times. It's like sometimes if I make a mistake, or there's that kind of tendency to, well, I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20 years. I can't have made that mistake. There's that sense of denial. But then it's like, well, I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20 years. I should be more humble than I was before. I shouldn't be becoming less humble, less able to see my mistakes. I should be more humble. There's kind of a interesting paradox there. I think people should respect me. People should respect me more because I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20 years. People should have a lot of respect for me, and they should give me the best offerings. And they shouldn't give me leftover food either. I have nothing against leftover food, by the way. I like leftovers. That's not a hint. It's not a hint, but it is like that thought could come up. I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20. How dare they offer me leftovers? Who do they think they are? I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20 years. So that's not very humble. I've been a bhikkhu for almost 20 years. I should be more willing to accept leftovers. More willing to take things that other people don't want. If my practice is actually working, I should be less arrogant, more humble. Less of a jerk. I should be less of a jerk than I was before. Hopefully I am. And for any of you who've been on the receiving end of my jerkiness, I apologize. I ask forgiveness. So anybody who's known me for a long time, I can't say that I haven't been a jerk before. But hopefully less of a jerk now at this point than in the past. I can think of, as an anagarika, as a novice, as a newly ordained bhikkhu, I can definitely think of times I was less than kind to my fellows in the holy life. I wasn't cultivating acts of goodwill, speech of goodwill, thoughts of goodwill. So it takes time. Now I can be very, very forgiving with others because I think, well, I've been there. I've done that before. So that causes me to be very, very forgiving with others. Sometimes I've talked about how this impressive Thai monk who lived here for a couple of years, Ajahn Prateep, who was here when I was more junior, and he gave me the advice. I remember in my second Vasa talking about how there's no way I'm going to make it to 5 Vasa, definitely going to disrobe. If I make it to 5 Vasa, I'll definitely disrobe after 5. There's no doubt about that. It's sure. It's certain. It's fixed. So he said, well, if you get to 5 Vasa and you're better, then you should keep going. But if you can say, well, okay, I'm worse than when I started. If I get to 5 Vasa and say I'm worse than when I started, then you can disrobe, no regrets. And so I took that advice, and I had to admit, well, I am kind of less of a jerk, and I am better in many ways. So okay, just keep going, and do that every 5 years. And so it's a very slow and painful progress as time goes on. But I do have to say, yeah, it's better. I do get angry less now than I used to. I can honestly say that. But it's a slow and painful process. I do get irritated less now. I do see things as not sure more now than in the past. This person, in the past it's like, this person is definitely that way and it's never going to change. But now it's like, oh, they changed. Oh, they trained themselves. Oh, they're different now. Okay, oh, they let go of that. Well, I can let go as well. So it's there can be progress. That's the positive side of anicca. The positive side of not sure is that we can make progress. We can change for the better. We aren't just stuck. We don't have to be just stuck in our habits and tendencies that we have now. We can we can train them, it can get better over time. Something I really have been appreciating about this book of Ajahn Sona's, as well as the whole wholehearted approach of it. And I can totally relate to him talking about how we have this tendency to stand aside and be an observer and not be fully in the experience. And I can just totally relate to that. And that sense of remembering to be anxious, remembering to, maybe there's something else I have to go do, or maybe there's somewhere else I have to be other than right here, right now. That's just a habit. It's a very strong habit of mind. It's, at its most fundamental level, it's restlessness. It's the type of restlessness that, according to the suttas, restlessness is only fully abandoned at arhantship. So that's that vacillating, that wavering. But then I started remembering all these other teachings of different Kruba Ajahns, and they're talking about the same thing, about being wholehearted, and about diving headfirst into the practice, going completely into the practice, not holding back, just really absorbing into it. If we're going to do Bhutto, just really going for it. If we're going to do Asubha, just really getting into it, really diving into it. If we're going to do Metta Kammatthana, really going for it, really seeing it from every single angle that we possibly can, really getting obsessed with it even. Or even the contemplation of anicca, just trying to see it from every different angle. Luang Por said that the most helpful things for him in his own practice were contemplation of anicca, of uncertainty, and patience. Those two qualities were very important for him. He said those were integral to him gaining success in his practice. Diving in head first. I just came across a sutta that in the Book of the Sixes in Anguttara Nikaya, where it's talking about qualities that are needed for arhantship. And one of it says, if one has a self-defeating attitude, one cannot attain arhantship. If one relinquishes their self-defeating attitude, they can attain arhantship. This is possible. If one has a sense of overestimation, they cannot attain arhantship. If one relinquishes overestimation, they can attain arhantship. This is possible. If one is duplicitous or given to flattery, one cannot attain arhantship. If one relinquishes duplicity and flattery, they can attain arhantship. This is possible. These are these real gems of suttas hidden in the Anguttara Nikaya. If you read through it, it's highly recommended. I remember a teaching of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Can't remember what question was asked, but he said something like, "Do not have a self-defeating attitude. This is wrong. Have confidence in yourself." It's like that self-defeating attitude. It's really tricky because part of us might feel like it's maybe good to have that attitude, but actually it's a hindrance. It's an obstruction. To be overly hard on ourselves. So I remembered just that sense of diving in, really going headfirst into the practice, really going for it, being fully there. There's so many times in the monastery over the years where I can think of where I wasn't fully there, where I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe I'll leave at some point and do this or that. And so not fully there, not fully in the present. Maybe I can get out of this situation somehow. So not fully committing. It's hard to fully commit to something. That's doubt. When we don't fully commit to something, that's the hindrance of doubt. So that sense of courageously relinquishing doubt and just fully committing to whatever practice we're doing, fully committing just to being in the monastery, fully committing to the schedule, fully committing to the meditation session, fully committing to the practice of goodwill or whatever practice that we're doing. So that sense of full commitment, that's a relinquishment of doubt right there. One of the qualities the Buddha talks about of stream entry, one is no longer perplexed about wholesome and unwholesome states. So I read into that a bit as that's the wholehearted approach, that's the self-confidence, self-assurance. Not arrogance in terms of the sense of self, but that sense of self-confidence. Which gives us energy, gives us strength to move forward. And there's too much dukkha already, so we don't need to make it worse for ourselves. I appreciate whenever our friend Tina comes here, and she talks quite a bit, but I'm finding that a lot of what she says actually has a fair amount of Dhamma in it these days. And I do enjoy listening to her speak because she's experienced a lot of dukkha, experienced depression, and also is in contact with people who experience depression and look to her for support. And there's a lot of dukkha. There's a lot of dukkha in the world. Suicide, people commit suicide even, and how sad, what a shame. That's compassion, that's karuna, wanting people to be free of this suffering. What a shame to reach such a point of hopelessness that you have to take your own life. And one thing Tina said that stuck with me, she's like, vaccinated, unvaccinated, they're all committing suicide. Like, how sad, how sad that that's happening. All people, whatever their status, whatever, people with different beliefs, people with different convictions, still reaching this sense of despair, of utter despair, hopelessness. So that we think about that's karuna, that's slightly different than metta. Metta is the goodwill, karuna is the wish to be free from suffering. So it's the same thing, but from a slightly different angle. May people be free of that suffering. May people be free of that despair. May they plant the causes to not have to experience that, or may they plant the causes to come out of that if they're in it. Because that's dukkha, that's mahadukkha. But we all have it to a greater or lesser extent. We all have the root of it. We all have the root of that type of dukkha. So we have to be careful. Some of the main advice I've heard from different Thai ajahns, one is like dong patibat, dong ramat rawang, which means when you practice, you have to be careful. Practice carefully. Patipat doi, ramat rawang, practice carefully. And then bai lui lui, just keep going, keep doing it, don't stop. Mai yut, don't stop practicing. Keep going. You won't be sorry if you keep going, keep cultivating. So however much dukkha we experience, then to keep going, keep cultivating, not to stop. That's ultimately goodwill for oneself. The practice of metta, as it's lined up in the Visuddhimagga, it talks about the metta for oneself, metta for loved ones, metta for neutral beings or people we don't have any feeling of pleasant or painful, but are neutral towards like strangers, people we pass by on the street. Then there's metta for enemies, people who would give rise to unpleasant feelings for us. That's considered the highest metta. So in his treatise on gratitude that Lungpar Liam wrote. So he's written a couple things over the years. He's written a few things, actually. And one is that treatise on walking meditation that I read the other day. And then when he was here, he actually wrote a treatise, a short, actually not that short, but a medium-length essay on gratitude. And he talked about metta, goodwill for one's enemies. And he took a very interesting angle to it. If we didn't have people who disagreed with us, or people who we consider are doing harm to us, how would we ever hone our wisdom? How would we ever learn to be more sure of where we're at if we didn't have enemies to highlight these things for us? So he talked about actually being grateful for those who we consider enemies, or those who we consider to be, say, against us or against what we believe in. People who are against us in some way, that's the very definition of an enemy. So one's enemies. You can be grateful, very grateful for those we would consider enemies or those who do harm, because that helps us to become more firm in our own goodness. So in this way, we can cultivate gratitude and goodwill for absolutely everybody without exception. There's something to learn from absolutely everybody. From people we feel neutral toward, strangers, somebody we pass by on the street. We pass by somebody we've never met before, we don't know at all. They might have mahadukkha in their lives. They might be suicidal. They might have some sort of noble attainment that we don't know about. We don't know. There's no way to know. So just as a good option, cultivating goodwill for those people who we would feel neutral toward, but also being open to the possibility they might have something that we can learn from. In his essay on walking meditation, Lungpar Liam talked about the Buddha as a tracker, which I found very interesting. He said if we have the eyes of a Buddha, we'd be able to see the impressions people are leaving everywhere in their footsteps. We'd be able to see the sorrow and the dukkha of others, or the happiness and joy and well-being of others. So when we do walking meditation, it's as if trying to make it as if the Buddha is watching us, that we leave the imprints of peace and serenity with every step. That's goodwill for oneself. So many different angles to come at this from if we just consider it. It takes wisdom too, so we have to see how, if we're not able to have goodwill for ourselves, using that discernment, why is that? In what way are we not able to have goodwill for ourselves, and why is that happening? There's another sutta that says, in the midst of others getting angry, we shall not get angry. So, with goodwill for ourselves, we also don't need to take on something. If somebody's coming at us with some sort of unwholesome energy, this will come up in a lot of Dhamma discussions. What do? The boss yells at us, or the coworker gets angry at us, or a family member expresses anger toward us, or a dear friend gets angry at us, or even betrayal. How do we relate to that? So the Buddha says, here where others get angry, we will not respond with anger, we will not get angry. Here where others are moved, we shall be unmoved. So that's noble, just to set those intentions. And it's okay if we fail. It's okay if we fail, but we keep going. We keep going. We don't just give up. We only truly fail when we completely give up. That's goodwill. That's goodwill for ourselves, to not give up. whatever happens. There's always a way forward, whoever we are, whatever situation we're in. As long as we're keeping the precepts, there's a way forward. So I'm looking forward to doing more readings on metta tomorrow morning. I also benefit from this, so I'll leave it there for this evening.